Just like old school days.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for being here. Our third panelist is parking, but because we're short on time and only have a limited amount of minutes we can spend together, I'm just going to get started. My name's Alex Lukas. I'm an assistant professor of print and publication at the University of California at Santa Barbara, and I've organized this panel today. Can only be hinted at with words: Californian text-based practices, with Sonya Sombreuil, Devin Reynolds, and Saber, hopefully. So I'm going to talk for like 10 minutes to just give us sort of the thesis of the argument I'm trying to make, and then we're going to get into a discussion and hopefully have some time for audience Q&A at the end of it. So a brief plug for me to start things off with. I run a project called Written Names Fanzine. I'm at table P22 in the zine area, and this whole project focuses on hyper-local name writing traditions, sort of graffiti that happens in a very specific area. So I'm really interested in text and place and that kind of junction of those two things. And that inspired this talk to really think about California as a site. So the title is stolen from this John Baldessari painting, What is Painting?, which is sort of notorious for he didn't paint it, he didn't touch it, he stole the text, hired a sign painter to do it. But it's sort of thinking about how pictures can function as words, how words can function as pictures. This was a larger part of Baldessari's practice, his California map project, where he traveled up and down the state looking for letters in the landscape and making letters in the landscape that corresponded to their location on the California map. Of course, Ed Ruscha is somebody who we want to reference when we're thinking about California and text, and this radical moment of sort of cribbing from sign painting, making the word itself the image of what it's doing, and even then starting to play with sound, that distinction and play between talking, writing, seeing, painting, appreciating. Corita Kent is also somebody I've been thinking a lot about in this context as a sort of uniquely Californian aesthetic. These bright colors, this moment where we're starting to reference sign work, like Colby poster printing, obviously, and thinking specifically about this neon, right, that was so prevalent in California from 1948 through 2012 because of that Colby poster print. And here we can even see Corita Kent as early as '69 starting to reference that colorway. And thinking also about teaching and how text and language becomes this sort of communal thing. So this is Corita Kent's workshop on Franklin Avenue. And of course, other ways that we sort of translate language. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Doc Guthrie, who taught at LATTC in the sign graphics program and sort of had this whole generation of students learning that trade of hand-painted signs, and how different this is from if we start to think about New York aesthetics and that sort of moment a little bit later when really text-based practices sort of become what they are. Jenny Holzer, of course, and these are responding to space, right? This is the project on the abandoned Times Square movie marquees. But I think of it as this sort of like cool sans-serif. Helvetica is that font, right? It isn't as playful as we see out here. So even on the side of this building, we have this great Barbara Kruger mural. I think it's important because it stands out, and I'm by no means denigrating East Coast practices, but thinking about how we can define them in a different way from maybe work that's made in California. And of course, the standardization. We think about text in New York, we think about Helvetica, we think about that as the sort of dominant wayfinding method. And even Lawrence Weiner, another person playing conceptually with text, but that deadpan, cool sans-serif. Back to California, how somebody else playing with that street grid, again, Ed Ruscha, does it in a more playful way, introducing imagery that's sort of disparate from what we're actually reading. And of course, Chaz, the lineage of graffiti here. This for me is super important when we talk about California text. There are other cities that have unique stylistic identifiable graffiti traditions, you know, Wickets in Philly, Bus Hopper up in San Francisco, but this development of Gothic font in LA is really important when we're talking about place. And what's so interesting for me about this is, as a bunch of people have written, it sort of references structures of power. It's subverting those official documents of the LA Times letterhead, of, you know, we think of death certificates, high school diplomas. This Gothic font becomes linked with cities. Thinking also then about place and text, the infamous ASCO, Pi and Deface, after hearing that Chicanx artists weren't sort of welcomed in LACMA, the collective spray painting of their names on that space is taking ownership. Also somebody like Chaka, super famous sort of underground figure. Sorry, this is from the 90s. This is Yesterday on Fairfax Avenue, so still active. And my favorite is when it starts to pop up in pop culture, when visual language has such a prevalence about space that we see it in something like Smells Like Teen Spirit, Seattle band, yes, but filmed in Culver City. Which brings us to our introductions. Saber has been working for 36 years, I think, innovating text practices, thinking about how graffiti and letter forms can be pushed. From the East Coast, this was incredibly influential for me, thinking about California graffiti. At the time, the largest piece done in the world on the LA River, buffed in 2009 with a major federal grant, but memorialized in the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History. So thinking about how this piece really acts as a landmark and a defining feature of Los Angeles. And here we can see both of these are in St. Louis, apologies, but that Gothic font really influencing the style going on here. And to this day, as Saber continues to push the boundaries of what we consider graffiti, street art, text-based practices, this is from the Beyond the Streets installation in 2018. Our next panelist, Devin Reynolds, who hails from Venice, who really references a lot of this vernacular signage, graffiti, these ways that we talk to each other in public. These are installation views from his solo show at Residency Art Gallery, Vaguely Political, from 2020. So we start to see that signage. We start to see that shared language of Los Angeles and Californian aesthetics brought into the work in a way that is diametrically opposed to that deadpan East Coast humor. This was the first time I saw your work at Deitch Gallery, excuse me, in 2001 as part of the Shattered Glass exhibition. And finally, Sonya Sombreuil, who also operates under Comtease, that bridge, right, that we think of fashion that for me is so interesting because it puts aestheticized text in public. It takes it out of that gallery space, the same way signage and graffiti functions outside of the white cube, but also plays with it sometimes. This was the first time I saw your work, was at the at the Huntington as part of Made in LA 2020. And there's a play here, right, between painting, fashion, object, and politics. I saw somebody wearing this yesterday, the famous now Rage Against the Machine Bernie Sanders shirt. And a brief plug, Sonya has designed a tote bag, printed matter fundraiser. You can get it outside. So that's the introduction. So we're going to talk for about half an hour and then open it up for Q&A with the audience. So maybe the first thing we can all talk about is the connection or disparity between text and politics. And is there something political about that very act of using text in your artwork? And how you navigate that politics. For anybody who wants to awkwardly start.
Yeah,
just a little.
Let me clear my throat for that one. All right. Hi, everybody. How's it going? Okay. To start, just the act of doing it out in public without permission alone, even if it's a naive act or if it's an act of chasing your ego or whatever it is, the fact that it's done on its own out in the wild makes it a political act on its own, even if it doesn't realize it's a political act in itself. And so for me, as far as a graffiti artist, which I call myself second and graffiti writer first, the act itself is most important. So all the pretty pieces, all the murals and everything else is second. And basically what I'm trying to do is push that act and push it still in the wild, which a lot of people, there's millions and millions of dollars of funding that actually go to stop that. So just to do it alone and pile it up on itself is beauty in itself. I get really excited when I see a lot of graffiti. Maybe I'm dysfunctional in some strange way. because I know that sometimes it is too much, and it does cause problems, but that's also part of being part of society in itself. And so it's a symptom of society in the sense that you have a lot of people who are chasing something, and they're putting that energy towards a creative path as opposed to doing things that we used to do, or things that it could lead to, which are very negative and very dangerous. So you have a lot of precious energy that needs to be used, and it's used in a creative manner. So even if it's done completely illegal, if it has color and they tried, then it matters, and that's what it, pushing it forward is what matters. Catching your first tag. It is political, even if you don't realize it.
Absolutely.
And that's what's most important. And then once you can acknowledge that, and once you realize it's political, then you're changing the way you choose to, put it out into society. Mm-hmm. And for me, the art is separate. They're two separate entities, So
even if they're sort of aesthetically related, the act of outside. Yeah,
absolutely.
I think in my work, it's less overtly political, but the text is like always referring to a point of origin or a reference that I think creates a kind of politic within culture, or that people, it's like a cipher, like some people will be able to understand it, but it's not for everybody to understand. And I think that in itself, is especially like true in graffiti or whatever, but the idea of kind of like obfuscating the meaning of something, but some people will be like literate.
Right. There's almost this code switching we can do with visual language, in group, out group. It can be visually accessible, but also have underlying meanings that folks can pick up on.
Absolutely. And it's all about those decoding.
Yeah.
To me, it's about the game of decoding. And that's what's most fun about it, is decoding. And that's, to me, like what is the most interesting path is decoding it and then understanding how it goes. And for me, it's two things. It's what pushes the element of what's illegal, which then the cities have to respond as to their technology is to push like sprayers and certain things that they didn't have before, cranes. And so it's pushing the limits of how an organic society can function. And it's the edges. So it's pushing the edges in a very nice way without hurting somebody over, And you use a lot of text in yours, so you use a lot of tags, you use a lot of
I do studio writer. I don't know. I guess for me, I don't know if I would consider the work that I do in the studio political at all. Even though there's been a few pieces I've done where there is some, I guess, like motive for me to, speak on something like outside of myself that might be political, but I don't think that's something that drives me when I'm in the studio. And if anything, I feel like I'm more like in a way collecting or archiving through the work, which I guess you could say is a political thing as we start to see some of this language disappearing every day.
Through sort of cycles of gentrification, this sort of maybe hand-done or community language is starting to disappear.
Yeah. And two, it's become part of the subconscious in the sense that it's constantly in the background, no different than advertisements. And so if they expect us to function like normal human beings, then we're processing, for me, all this, since we're babies, all this bombardment of advertisements. And so that's acceptable, and that's okay to bombard us with that. But just the act of just tagging on something is a felony to a certain degree, certain places, certain times. I would rather tag on the billboard, that to me matters more than the billboard itself. And so,
Well, and that the billboard itself functions as a structure of capital, that this
Yeah.
advertising is not neutral, that it's just out there.
Absolutely.
Well, maybe then, Devin, I can start with you on the reverse question, which is the next one, on the poetics of incorporating text into work and where that sort of functions.
Yeah, I'd say for me it starts maybe before poetry or before poetics. Um, I feel like a broken record always talking about fishing, but I grew up working on fishing boats and like still work on them off and on when I have the time. And for me, that was a big part of using text in my work, was knowing that like my buddies on the fishing boat and people that I've lived and worked with in that environment, like they're not coming to Mocha to look at, or they're not going to sit in front of a Rothko and understand that. And maybe they could, but just speaking from experience, I felt like for me text offered an easier, maybe like an easier dialogue between the art and the viewer.
Mm.
And I guess you could get into like literacy and stuff like that if you wanted to about it, but yeah.
There's something about that act of reading feels more approachable or more open.
Yeah, a little bit, until you say something people don't like, because I've definitely experienced a couple times showing work in spaces that was maybe out of context.
Mm-hmm.
And you could definitely feel that there's a visceral reaction that happens with people. They could see like the most profane, like nude painting, and it's just like whatever, somebody getting chopped up. I don't know. But then they could read the text, and it hits different. And I picked up on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's written on the wall, too.
Sonya, poetics?
I mean, the main reason I make clothes is because I was so drawn to like the language and poetry and especially in music, and it felt much more available for me to like put that on a garment or whatever than put it on a painting, which I hugely admire. But I think like that's always been kind of my first love is not necessarily poetry in the like conventional genre of it, but with the music, yeah, and the like language just of like album covers, book covers, all of that stuff. That's like my main attraction.
Yeah. And those spaces that we're used to seeing design text, we're used to seeing sort of aestheticized text.
Yeah.
And also like, I kind of recently talked about this, but there's like kind of like a bird song quality of it. Like you wear it in the world and people who know what you're talking about can relate.
Yeah.
So,
right, the affinity of,
Yeah.
and then that funny moment a couple of years ago when Misfits shirts got to be really popular, and the question
Yeah,
was,
totally.
what's your favorite Misfits song?
What's your favorite Misfits song?
Saber, thoughts on poetics?
Thoughts on poetics. Right now, it's making sure the kids aren't going nuts.
An important.
and I would say music is a big part of where I get a lot of the language in my paintings,
Mhm.
especially the last couple of years. And that didn't happen like on purpose or something. I just like kind of spiraled its way into my practice in the studio. And then also like I collect records, album covers, CDs, tapes, and all that. But I don't know. I guess when I first started making art, I was I think I appropriated a lot less. But maybe it's a fear of being vulnerable in a certain way with using my own language. I tend to utilize songs that I listen to in the studio a lot. That's the basis for a lot of my work.
Poetics. All right, well, this is what part of the decoding comes in. As opposed to what a word means, once you have letters and you take the aspect of letters in themselves, you then have style and that whole aspect of what style means, and then breaking down this rabbit hole of different influences that come from, and then decoding those influences is really interesting. So for me, it's about movement, it's about flow, it's about how those particular motions and gestures are going to portray a feeling. And so that feeling is the poetics,
Mm-hmm.
and that motion is the poetics, and those gestures are poetics. And so those same motions and gestures can also be translated into other things as well. So music, dance, all those different things. So they anything that has a poetic within itself, which is something that's trying to search for a deeper meaning, even if it's just a few words put together. When it comes to the aspect of style, is when you really start trying to decode, and that same aspect of decoding, understanding wild style to why someone places something in the public, it opens up a door that it allows you to start decoding other things that have nothing to do with the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so your mind starts changing and shifting in ways that you didn't notice before. And so over the years that piles up, and style is something that's constantly forming, even if I'm not actually addressing it. So even as I talk to you right now, there's a cluster that's moving, shaping, forming. That cluster is what, when you put the letters together, and that cluster is the organism in itself. And so when you have this organism, you have to start attending to it and taking care of it and feeding it, which at the end of the day, you find out is your ego and misplaced energy that's used in a good way, even if it's vandalism. But style is, and we all have a style because we're searching for certain aesthetics. And so those aesthetics are a representation of our style, the ones that we like. And so that's what I love, is the decoding of how style can translate into different formats. And that's what's really cool. As I've gotten older, I've been able to see those motions and gestures and why things are placed. And like I said, it's like you've taken the pill and it hasn't gone away and it never left, and then you're just frying balls the rest of your life, and it sucks because sometimes it doesn't go away and it causes problems in your personal life, especially as you're a parent, when you want to go fucking hang off something like an idiot.
Fair.
I mean,
we're repelling now. Sorry.
No, you're good. No. I was just gonna say, like, when I look around, like, I love when you were bringing up, like, we're like bludgeoned to death with billboards and advertising, and especially when I see like a lot of graffiti places, that is like the irrepressible kind of poetic nature that we have. Like, I mean, I remember reading like Rommel's thing or whatever, his writing, and him kind of talking about the, systemizing or the kind of like repression of letters in themselves as, they're like sigils or their beings, or they're alive, and then they got like made into typefaces and King James Bible and all this stuff. And like when I see graffiti writing, I'm just kind of like, this is like the push back of like our poetic in nature,
Right.
to obviously like these containers.
Right. What I find interesting too is why are so many people attracted to one particular space? So why is one window, one pole, one wall, why is there 10,000 tags on one particular space? And what I find interesting is the invisible nature of why people have different movements and why they go to that, and why they're naturally like attracted to those certain things. And what's interesting is when you look at one particular spot over time and you see how that spot piles up and changes, and when you can actually start peeling it off the wall and you have those chunks. I used to go down to the Belmont tunnels and then make sure I would take pieces of them, and then so I have like pieces of like Belmont. And so I'd go to all the different yards and like, peel the paint off and take those chips home.
Yeah, there's like one tree at the park where I walk my dog that's like all tagged up, and it's like also like the most accessible tree. Like they don't want to go deeper or something, but I'm also kind of like, it's funny. It's like there's permission, like one person did it, therefore like people are allowed to do it. There's competition, you know, and it's also like becomes like a party or something. It's so cool.
And it speaks to the movement of bodies through space, right? How where community exists, where it sort of forms, even if it's outside of sort of traditional structures like a lecture hall or a museum. So to back up briefly, something that I think all of you sort of are referencing is this notion of quoting or appropriation, whether it's music lyrics, album aesthetics, you know, the history of wild style from New York. Because that sort of quoting and appropriating isn't quite the right word, but how you think about what you reference or how you bring in references, especially around language that feels so quotable sometimes.
How?
How, why, when you don't.
Well, like, okay, right now, I've been really into like really slow, dirgy doom metal. So I'm making a painting like that, and it's got a bunch of skulls and like references from not not contemporary metal, but some like old hair metal album covers that I dug up, record digging, and like everything in the painting has to do with that. So I feel like for me, I set like a parameter for how I wanted to build the world in that painting, and then some of the stuff comes to me like if it's just a song I'm listening to, and like the lyrics hit and it makes sense for the painting. But then sometimes I go searching for it too. Yeah.
Sonya, quoting?
I was just reflecting on it. Like I think like whatever, it's kind of cheesy, but when I was younger and I'd be like going through stuff, I would just hear, you know, in the most inane places, you'd hear a kind of like message, a universal message or a divine kind of, you know, and I think like I use that a lot. I'm in like a different stage of my life. I do a lot of searching for things now, which I kind of like don't really like doing. You know, I want it to like come to me, and methods for searching are different now than they were for most of my life. But I feel like, yeah, it's for me, it's like homage or kind of like fan art or whatever has always been really primary to my practice. So a lot of times it'll just be stuff I'm into, you know, like you're saying, you know, just be like playing this album over and over again. But sometimes it's like, you know, I found this book from this like poet who self-published in my hometown, you know, and I just like, the title was so cool. I made a t-shirt, you know, like I kind of only read one poem. But yeah, I mean, I love titles. I love when things like really slap and like and you know, graffiti names and monikers, like same, that's always like just so cool. Quoting, I feel like I often quote stuff like that.
Well, there are these moments when, you know, I think especially graffiti grabs the popular imagination. Cool Disco Dan in DC, other folks who sort of, raise to that level of popular imagination and then almost become quotable.
I saw a Simpsons episode or something that referenced Banksy.
Banksy?
You know, or whatever, you know, it's that's how far the culture has gone.
Yeah.
You know?
Right, the Simpsons are doing this appropriation act now.
I mean, it's beyond appropriated at this point. The auction houses are appropriated. So it's been appropriated at this point, you know? And I think that's why continuing to push the aesthetic and to push the art and to push the act and to include the aesthetic in the works is to the act of keeping it alive. And to me, that's what's kind of important. But the work itself, I think, too, is now a piece to document the paintings themselves, as opposed to the graffiti itself. the act is more important than for it to stay. So it's interesting to see things that have lasted so long that they kind of are used to being part of the neighborhood and a part of subconscious in the background. Those would be, permanent walls and certain things. But I'm just still fascinated that we're still here and that it's still going. But for me, I think it's most important that we push what's most honest with ourselves when we do the work and we engage the creative act, whatever it is, painting, creating works of all sorts. I think as long as we're honest with ourselves when we do it, then you're challenging what's right. And to me, that's what's, so if there are different things that end up in the background, there are titles or certain things. If it's something that, makes you happy to see it. For me, it's about following the stomach tickles and the little brain races, because I have so many of them. So the ones, I'm like, if I smoked meth, I would, I don't do any drugs. But that's just how much energy I need to deal with. And so it needs to go to many places.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah,
whatever.
No, I was going to add to that, because I don't know what it is, but my mom was an antique dealer, and then my dad, he also collected computer parts. So I come from kind of borderline hoarding, collecting. Is that right? That's my sister. Yeah.
Can we get verification?
Yeah, we got verified. But I found that in some ways, the use of collecting language for me, it helps me feed that need or that urge to collect. And I don't know what it's about. Like, I know that I gotta collect signs and typography or whatever it is that I'm obsessed with. But sometimes it's nice having something that's not tangible and doesn't cost money. And whether it's being on YouTube, listening to music, and then I don't mean to blab too much right now, but I started archiving all different types of media with signage and typography in it that looks interesting or is hand painted. So I might be listening to a song, looking for a lyric to quote in the painting, and then I'll also be screenshotting. I'm on the computer screenshotting 6 signs in the music video. But it's been creating this crazy web for me in my little collecting world. I don't know if I call it archive yet. I only have a couple of those fancy archive boxes. But
you print them out?
I do print some things out, but most of my digital stuff is just digital on the computer. But then I also when I am in a collecting phase, I collect found photographs with signage in them. There's about anything with signage in it, pretty much.
Well, maybe that brings us to the last question, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. I was listening to a lecture the other day by somebody at Cooper Union talking about black letter in Mexico. And they had this term that was the letter form environment of a place. Mm-hmm. And, thinking about archives, thinking about sort of growing up places, would you all maybe, and we've all traveled extensively, lived elsewhere, how do you think that sort of letter form environment of Southern California, if it has, and if so, how it has influenced your work and creative practice?
Well, I know for me, growing up, my dad was really big on knowing streets and where you were going, and I guess just part of him schooling me, because I was once I was 12 or 13, or really 11 or 12, pretty much just hit the street, not in a bad way or whatever, but get on our skateboards at 5:30 in the morning, and we're all off doing our thing. But one of the biggest things that he taught me was remembering landmarks, and in no way was this related to Ed Ruscha at the time, but up on Lincoln, what's that off of Lincoln, and I forget what the cross street is, right off the 10. There's a Norms, right? There used to be a Norms there. Maybe it's still there. But I remember that was one building or sign in particular. I can remember him like drilling it into my head, like for some reason, like whatever. When you get to norms, you know, whatever. This is where you're at. So in a way, I think it was kind of ingrained in me by accident. Just and even in the car, actually, with my dad, he would just always be like saying like buildings and signs and shit. I would be paying attention to that, I guess.
Yeah, maybe that's a symptom of the compulsiveness of what we're dealing with advertisement. You know, at such a young age that we feel compelled to collect archives and little treasures from it that we see. You know, and that's, I think, a symptom of this constant reel that we're dealing with that's in our eyes and in our background, you know, right now as we look. Printed matters, there it is. Now that's going to be in my head. So
language as the way of defining space.
Yeah, visual language.
Yeah.
You know, so I just feel the need to push back against this, you know.
Yeah.
That's important. All making art to me is important, and all making art is its own political act in the self of searching for one's own path. And that's a political act in itself because you're not following everyone else. You're trying something new. And so that is important. Even if it's terrible.
And a spiritual act because you're, you know, a unique iteration of, you know, God or whatever. And so to like aspire to express that is like a man's path, you know.
Yeah. That's I'm just bullshit.
No, also, I was going to say, I know you didn't get to go in on it too deep, but you mentioned something when you were scrolling through in the beginning about the difference between New York and Los Angeles-based text artists. And I thought that was kind of trippy, just thinking about California vernacular signage. And, like, it is interesting looking at Barbara Kruger. I'm trying to think about who else you've referenced from, like, the New York school. But there's a tightness, like it's so New York, their work.
But then I feel like New York graffiti is so freaky, you know?
Yeah, but I guess just in the development of like how an environment will inform the things that somebody makes.
Mm-hmm.
Like I feel like I'm looking at the, you know, like the scrolling on the what is that called?
The like news Chiron.
Where when you look at, you know, projects that people have done in LA around typography and signage, like you do see a different, you do see a looseness, you know, kind of like what you were talking about, which I think you were talking even about, like with tagging, how like, you know, using your body to express the way that you want people to see your tag to feel.
Right.
I pick that up in these works.
Well, when it comes to West Coast, I want to say something that's important, and that is when we started this mission of painting graffiti in that sense, we were on a mission to push possibly what New York had done and push it further, and that was in the 90s. And then it kind of grew on its own, and then we watched the West Coast aesthetic spread worldwide. And to me, that's what was so interesting, to be somewhere like in Bangkok and to see that aesthetic, you know, flourish, that particular aesthetic flourish. To be somewhere like Slovakia and then be able to reference a certain aesthetic, you know, while, you know, dying communism is like empty in the background. And so let's paint those buildings.
Did you guys talk about it when it was developing?
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
all the whips and everything?
Absolutely.
And like aggressive?
Absolutely.
Really?
Like we were obsessed about every picture. And so how we would talk is like, to a certain degree, like dance in the sense that you see it happen. Mm-hmm. So you acknowledge it. So you say, oh, I heard that little piece. So my friends would kind of clown me, and because I used to call them gem spinners. Like I was silly. So it'd be like this magical idea of like painting this, you know, something that's precious to a certain degree. And so they would be gem spinners, kind of this silly idea. So, but the gem spinners in their own way are that aesthetic, talking about breaking down all those different elements of it. That's a, you know, West Coast took over straight up. Now, right now, West Coast is completely taking over. And as far as like graffiti and the element of that aesthetic, We've been on a mission to spread it worldwide, and we're very proudful to be, from Los Angeles, and so we operate a little differently than others, which is kind of cool because we live by certain codes.
Yeah.
But
Well,
go West Coast. I mean, spread.
Very impressive.
Straight up,
Sonya, you started Hum Teas when you were in Massachusetts. You grew up in Santa Cruz, started in Massachusetts, and now brought it back here.
Mm-hmm.
Has that sort of geographic transition influenced, changed things, supported things in unexpected or suspected strategic ways?
I think I don't know that it has. I mean, I feel like I'm home being California. It was interesting. You kind of answered this question talking about like your childhood or whatever. But I've said this a lot. But like my dad was kind of a prodigious he dubbed everything, and like our house was lined with like VHS tapes. He made labels for everything, and now he's like super into CDs and DVDs and stuff. But he had cabinets full of cassettes with like labels he made and artwork he made for everything. So he would constantly be making like me tapes or making me stuff, and that like labeling and like hand lettering and he was someone who had his own style, and so that's kind of like the biggest influence on me. I didn't grow up in LA or in an extremely urban environment at all, but the idea of like handwriting and having your own style is definitely like a point of origin.
Yeah, and speaking of point of origin, like we have one of the most unique hand styles, and that's gang graffiti. That is specifically Los Angeles based, and so that's something that's flourished on its own, good or bad. It's something that the aesthetic itself definitely influences, like how we approach certain whips, certain gestures, certain aesthetics. It's all buried within it because it's buried within the background. And so one of the things I am most fascinated with is gang graffiti. And, also homeless graffiti, like crazy graffiti, like crazy people graffiti. I love like wacky shit. I follow it. I seek it out. I love that stuff. But
we've got a dude over by our studio. What is the guy by our studio? Help. Have you seen Help? Help in Blantaso?
no.
Yeah.
Oh, dude, they're pretty sick. They've got it like really crushed over by our studio. Yeah, call the FBI. Yeah.
Hyper local name writing. I love it. So, acknowledging we need to be out of the room in 4 minutes, is there an audience question or two that we could field? In the back?
Yeah, I've always been really interested in the intent behind how art is bounded by the artist's choice in naming, and how so much of art is bounded through that textual lens. And so so I guess my question is, how was your intent behind naming your pieces changed over time?
Oh shit! Honestly, just about and I don't mean this to be silly. Almost every time someone asks me for a title, I usually give them a different one on accident. I mean that wholeheartedly. But I actually hate titling paintings. I think it's kind of lame.
It's kind of corny when you really go like make a big thing about it. It's kind of like a little silly, but yeah, it depends. Each person is different, quite frankly, So there's no specific as far as titling goes. It depends on what the story I'm trying to tell within the painting. So if I don't have a particular story to tell, then it's just the visual language itself, as opposed to whatever the statement behind the title might be implying or contextualizing. And so, if there's no reason for a title, then there shouldn't be one, or whatever. And that's kind of like, I guess we're just not that serious about it unless we're inspired to put one. So usually it's untitled. Most of the time.
Sonya, titles.
Titles? I don't, think too much about titles. Like in the things I make, there's like elements and I'll spin it off of that. But I do have a brand name, you know, and like you have your writing names and stuff, and I think that's such an incredible like process to go through, like naming yourself, you know. I get asked about my brand name a lot, and I don't have like a coherent answer, and it's not something I ever like feel like I need to explain to people. But there is this thing, like I think about this with graffiti names all the time, where it's like there's the way it sounds, there's the way it looks, there's like the stars of associations it comes up with, you know, there's like the individual letters if you vibe with them, you know, and like with Cunties, I like the way it was, you know.
And I think maybe something that we haven't addressed that we could do for another hour is then the act of speaking, right? The tease, T-E-E-S, also sounds like teasing, like these confusions and layers that language can take when spoken out loud that often come up, I think, with titles and the almost subversive potential of then, oh, now somebody needs to say this out loud to reference his work. Yeah.
That's
Sorry,
coding.
2 more questions, 1 and 2.
I'm curious how your outward practice is interpreted into studio practice, and how like each of you use experiences with language and text into your studio.
I'll go first fast because we gotta go, I guess. I do 2 styles. One is to continue the aesthetic of graffiti gestures, and then the other one is I like to do landscapes and things of that nature. So that's kind of the visual storytelling of who Ryan is as opposed to who Saber is. And so those are the places that I see. So they're 2 separate entities to a certain degree.
Yeah, I mean, you collect like signage and stuff. I'm like always looking for books or albums or flyers or you know me. I love like all kinds of different paper mania stuff. And just having those things around, like they emerge from your like bookshelf when they need to or whatever, you know.
I'm stumped on that one. I'm sorry.
Well, I guess, so Savannah and I were talking about how there was, you were there talking about this. There's a mural of yours in New Orleans, right? And it's still up. Sorry.
Damn, man.
And
Bringing up skeletons in the closet.
my thing is I'm like, okay, well, you know, a lot of, like you were mentioning, that a lot of things get, like, built over, painted over, people are reattached or invited into these particular walls or spaces or poles, and then some pieces stay up and, like, people don't fuck with them.
Right.
And I'm like, well, I'm like, is there...
That's a symptom of the individual and their reputation.
Right.
That's the force field.
Right. Because I'm like,
You have
okay,
to earn the force field. You have to
Right.
work hard for the force field.
right,
It's like,
because I also wonder
and
if
you don't always have it.
Yeah, because if for someone who, you know, like you coming from here and being there, I'm like, is it that there was a special, like, something that you bring as an artist in your work that people were, like, very drawn to and didn't want to fuck with, or, like...
No, I think it was really because really how I parlayed with the writers, because I was like, just to be totally candid, I'm embarrassed to say this in front of you, but I was like a grown adult toy basically. I was like 22 or something and like sucked really bad at graffiti, and I was kind of doing these like really bad murals that I'd hope to God, I don't know why. But anyways,
The rookie cards that we all hope to forget.
But like one of those like one of the first ones I did, we ended up getting, you know, kind of like pressed by a bunch of writers throughout the week that we painted it. But then I started painting pretty hard after that. So mine, I think, in the end, I'm not saying that I'm like any king of graffiti in New Orleans, but I did do my thing enough to where people don't touch my stuff.
And that's just putting in the work and building those relationships, just like any other networks, just like anything else, really. It's just getting your feet wet and getting dirty, meeting people, and then they see your face and you meet them. And when you're younger, it's always being belligerent, you know, because we're young and stupid. But as we get older, try to swim easier.
Well, I apologize. I know the next talk has to set up a Zoom link. Thank you all so much. Thank you to the panelists. Really grateful for this. We can continue outside, but I think we need to move.